The cold open to the 27th season of Saturday Night Live might be its most iconic. Shot just 2.5 weeks after 9/11, it starts with Mayor Rudy Giuliani on the stage. To his right, the police commissioner. To his left, the fire chief. And behind him, all sorts of first responders in uniform, firefighters, policemen. He gives a speech thanking all of the heroes. Gets a big round of applause. And kids, I'm telling you, he was a really popular mayor. Like, I know he's just like the weird guy from the Four Seasons landscaping thing now, but back in September of 2001, his approval rating was pretty undefeated. So after he gets a big round of applause, the camera pans over, and there's Paul Simon, SNL staple. He's got an FD&Y hat, an acoustic guitar, and he starts playing the Simon and Garfunkel classic, The Boxer, a song about a fighter who continues to get hit, finds himself down on the mat, but keeps getting himself back up. A song of resilience, of perseverance. And it was actually requested by the SNL creator and executive producer Lorne Michaels. And at the end of the performance, you can see Michaels go up to the stage. He's clapping. He walks right up to Giuliani. Giuliani gives him a big hug. And I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially says, SNL is an American institution. It's a New York institution. And we're so happy that the show is going to go on. And Lauren looked at him and he said, can we be funny? And Giuliani said, why start now? And it was a moment where, for those of us who remember 9/11 well, it was just, there's this collective grief across the nation. And it felt so nice to laugh and even to kind of get permission that it was okay to laugh. And I've been thinking a lot about 9/11 in the wake of the Eaton fires, because especially in the beginning, there were so many parallels. The amount of love and humanity that we saw in those first few days was astounding. People coming left and right. What can I get you? What can I donate? Clothes, money, time, whatever you need. I was in so many different threads on so many different platforms, and they were all pretty much the same thing. How are you and how can I help? And then there was the community and how we were able to come together. Neighbors who would see each other walking dogs and kind of just wave. Names we didn't even know. All checking up on one another. Who's okay? Did everyone make it out safe? I'm telling you, there's so many streets and neighborhoods in Altadena of neighbors who have trauma bonded. And then, of course, lastly, there was that collective grief. And in the beginning, it was really collective, because whether you owned or rented, you had a small house or a big house, you've been there for 2 decades or 2 months, we all faced the same issue. The place we had just called home was no longer there. But something weird's happened as we've moved forward here the last 3 months. That grief is splintering. It's collective in that so many of us are still grieving and mourning, but it's taking on a lot of different forms and splintering. And I don't know if this is a bad thing. It's probably just the natural evolution. But we're starting to get on different wavelengths. Recently, they had to extend the opt-out time because so many people are paralyzed and have not even made the choice to either get the Army Corps of Engineers to remove their debris or to go the private route. We also have neighbors who've had to sell their homes to say goodbye to the place that they imagine getting old and the vision of what that looked like. I've even talked to renters who've talked to the people they called landlord and said, what's going to happen next? And the answer is just, I don't know. So they're having to grieve what they lost and living in a place of uncertainty. And then there's other people who've grieved and in the traditional sense of the 5 stages, maybe hit something that you might call acceptance. And now that grief is turning into fire and fuel and energy and this desire to rebuild. And I'd say that I'm in that category. But I don't know. How do we do this, and how do we get people excited when we have so many people who are still mourning and still so hurt and in such a place of grief? I wanted to explore this topic. So that's why my guest today is Vanessa Fierstadt. Vanessa is a licensed marriage family therapist who specializes in grief. She's been running grief groups for Altadena residents since the fire. I wanted to talk to her because I wanted to understand how we can meet our citizens where they're at and how maybe that collective grief at some point can transform to collective energy or collective excitement. Because we don't have a nationally syndicated TV show here in Altadena. And if you listen to episode 1, you'll realize we don't even have a mayor. So we don't have anyone giving us permission to take steps forward, giving us the hope that even though we're in a place of pain, maybe we're going to get out of this okay. And so I want to explore this with Vanessa. And I want to dive into grief, how it evolves, and why it's just so different for so many people. And ultimately, how we can channel what we're all feeling and maybe get to a place of hope and maybe take that same lesson from the boxer and get resilient and start persevering and being able to get this rebuild going a little faster and with a little more momentum. I'm Austin LaRoche, and this is the Altadena Rebuild, episode 2, Good Grief. Vanessa, welcome to the show.
Hi, Austin. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I want to start with collective grief. So what does collective grief look like in a community that has not just lost homes, but kind of a shared sense of place? And then how is that collective grief different from individual grief?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we're having this conversation now because we first experienced real collective grief during COVID. Where we were experiencing the same thing all together, but separate, right? Like we have this experience, and with this fire, it brings up so much of those layers and pieces, but in completely different ways, right? So the difference for me in collective grief is, we are doing it together. There's a shared experience. You've lost similar things, right? Like in COVID, we lost the ability to be together, the ability to feel safe in our bodies and be outside. And this is very similar, the collectiveness of, not being able to go back to our home, not being able to hear the kids play, not being able to watch or, the sunset on the path we would walk every night, and people in the Altadena community understand that, that there's a sharedness to the magic of the place. And so I think there's a lot of grieving happening around that, as well as the grief of the actual tangible things. Right? Not only the homes, but the things within those homes, right? The smells around the house, right? All of these things that are happening, right? So it's visceral too, it's emotional, it's visceral. The difference between obviously collective and individual is if you lose a person, let's say from a death, right? You're experiencing that maybe in a very isolating way, right? Because that was the relationship with that person that no one really had but you. Right. And in this case, everyone's grieving a space, a collected space, a neighborhood, their communities, their grocery stores, their places of worship. Right.
Yeah. And one of the things that I was talking about in the beginning is like everything that you're saying, that collectiveness is all shared, especially January 9th, maybe through the end of January. And now we're 3 months later and we're grieving a lot of different things. How have you seen in your groups kind of the difference in where people are at and how they're grieving? How is that?
So yeah, it's really interesting. And you made me think of something too of, I've had a lot of people who want to be in shared spaces together, but it's almost like they're not ready. And I think there's how is this, do I need to be sadder Like, do I need to be sitting in a place where other people are experiencing this with me? So to be honest with you, a lot of the people I'm seeing right now are in individual therapy.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Because there's a lot happening within the community. There's a lot of other groups going on. And my experience from what's been shared with me is I'm angry and upset when I go into that group because someone else has a different opinion than me, or someone's ready to do something that I'm not ready to do. And so it's not just grief. There's a lot of anger and frustration. And so they're finding safety in the individual therapy,
Mm-hmm.
and having boundaries around the groups. So that's really interesting. However, I will say that I think the most beautiful thing that I've experienced and witnessed is with the idea of collective grief. I also think there's this idea of collective resiliency. And I
Ooh.
think that so much of the community came together in droves. And here's my thing as a grief therapist. We know this to be true in death. Usually after 6 months or a year, like the support drops off. We call it like
Mm-hmm.
the drop off. And this is going to be important here. People came out really heavy at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think my thing has been that collective resiliency needs to stay, right? We need to be running the groups
Mm-hmm.
longer than a year. The community needs to be doing gatherings and potlucks and rituals longer than a year. There needs to be things that are, people can rely on even after a period of time.
Yeah, I think that that speaks to something that's really interesting to me, because I know one of the things I'm interested in is that collective resilience, right? And feeling like, how do we go from this collective heartbreak and grief, find that resilience, maybe find some hope, and then at some
Right.
point get to like the energy and enthusiasm. Because like I don't know if for right or wrong, I'm like a natural problem solver. Like, no, the fire doesn't get to win. We get to win. We're rebuilding tomorrow. Let's go, 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 go. And
Yeah.
it's one of those things where we want to meet our neighbors where they're at. So how do
Right.
some of us who are more in that, trying to maybe push some collective
Right.
resilience, how do we really communicate with our neighbors who are still just in that grief space?
I think it's this ability to name both truths. That one doesn't have to trump the other, and I think this is where the frustration's coming in. I
Yeah.
think people are like, oh, my neighbor's like ready to go and I'm on the couch and like, Santa Clarita with my family because that's where, and they're like, I can't even think about that right now. And I think it's being gentle and having a little bit of, grief-informed communication, grief-informed, care of both can be true. I know this must be really difficult for you and you're not ready. You're not in a place where I'm at with this, and that's okay.
Yeah.
I think it's about permission giving that both can exist, right? It's like grief in life, and I think this is the important thing. People hear the word rebuild, and there is this, I think, like, how dare you take away what we had? Like, there's almost like this part of like,
Hmm.
you can't replace a person, right? When they die, you
Yeah.
can't replace a space or a home when it dies as well. And I think that this has to be part of that conversation of that doesn't have to be their truth and it doesn't have to be your truth. And
Hmm.
you can rebuild while integrating what also was.
Yeah. Wow. There's so much there, because like I've always felt like I'm like, proverbially, the way that I feel is like my hand is out to anybody who's still on the mat, and I will help them get up, and it's going to be
Yeah.
there as long as they need it,
Yeah.
right? But there's this other part that you're talking about that I think is a lot more touchy, on the idea of rebuild, right? As somebody who, literally, one of my life core values is I see possibilities. Like, there's an
Right.
optimism, and there's a, and so I don't know if I would ever say like we're gonna build back better, because I'm terrified that would, to your point, like hurt someone's truth. So maybe it's more like we want to try to build back the best that we can, in the best version of better that we can find. But I think what you're talking about, that really is speaking to that tension, because the other elephant in the room is not everyone's going to be able to be a part of the rebuild, and that
Right.
sucks.
Right.
And so there's grief beyond, like some people can grieve a dog that passed away and then they're going to buy a new Labrador a couple weeks later. And some people are just going to have to lose the dog. And like,
Right.
that is
Mm.
how do we help those neighbors? Because those are the ones that like, they're on their way out, but like, they're still part of this story. They're still part. We couldn't even have the opportunity to have this amazing town, to rebuild it without them. How do we honor them in that grief, knowing like they're not going to be able to be a part of the rebuild?
Yeah. Yeah. I do think it's part of that when it comes to those spaces, that individual integration of their grief and their space and their home, and including them in what this new chapter is going to be if they want to be part of it. I think it's this important piece of the grief is, this place mattered to me, right? It will always matter to me. And it's that this version mattered to me. And the new version may or may not matter to them, but for some people it will. Right. And, some people are like, I've talked to a lot of people who, like you're talking about, they're like, well, I'm at a certain age, I want to go retire in, Palm Springs, and it's like, that's what they want to do. Some people are like, it's too much work. We've got young kids. We want to, but I've been talking to a lot of people about how to integrate what was, right? And this might sound odd, but this is my world of grief of like, when someone dies and there's cremains, there's ashes, right? There is something to physically have. And I have talked to folks about going back to their space when it's safe, if they want to, and actually retrieving some of the ashes from their home.
Wow.
And using that, either, again, integrating it into whatever new space they're going into. Again, that this didn't just happen and it's done. This happened and it was my life, and I'm carrying it with me in a different way now, right?
Wow. And it's so interesting, that perspective, what you said, this version, right? Because you're right. We're mourning a setting.
Right.
What Altadena was before the fire is never coming back.
Right.
And so, even if I have that feeling of like, this place means so much to me, gosh darn it, we got to rebuild it tomorrow.
Right.
I feel like there's an acceptance I have. Well, it's not going to be the same version, but like, this is what we have to do. And I can totally see even just like the unknown of what that next version looks like, being something that's got to be so hard. And then, then you got so much information and things that, make you terrified, whether it be through costs or, who's selling, who's buying. There's so much convolutedness. So how does that work from a grief perspective? Like, because in the literary terms, like a setting is that confluence of time and space, right? Like Saving Private Ryan's setting was beaches in Normandy in 1940, right? And so many of us, let's say Christmas break 2024, Altadena, that setting, I was talking to somebody recently and he's, I just want to go back. I want to go back to that week. And like, how does one grieve a setting, and how is that just different from grieving, a person or a law or something physical?
I think that there's so many layers to it that make it so complex in the grieving process. Why? Because it's complicated grief now. You're not just grieving one thing. You're grieving the dwelling. You're grieving the safety of being in that dwelling. You're grieving the smell of the air in the morning on your walk with your dog and your kids. You're grieving, seeing those neighbors in those little streets, after work every day. There's and as I say that too, I have goosebumps. I mean, there's so many layers here, and I think this is going to be the important part for folks who are having this transition back into this new version of how do we cultivate that again? Right. I think that's the heart and soul of Altadena. It's not so much about, it's the feeling of the community. Right.
Yeah. And I'll say that I one of the weird things that happened to me, my son's fourth birthday party was in our backyard the Saturday before the fire, and we had a close friend who actually lived with us during COVID. And when we were walking, I said, well, wait, what happened to that neighbor? And then that one, and who are they? And like, I was so embarrassed because I grew up and I knew every single person on my street. And I had a few people that I knew. But the second the fire hit, it was like rallying everybody around that. Those people who walk the dogs, there's names and email. Are you okay? Are you okay? And since then, we've been having like those meetups. And like, of all the things that we're grieving, like there's actually a huge excitement for me to be living on my street again with these people who I know now. If I like need an egg, if I'm out of eggs, I will look in any direction and I will have someone to go to.
That's right.
Because that's like, so the community part is like, that part's really, really exciting. But to your point, that's me and the people I've talked to on my street who are rebuilding. That's this new version we're putting in our head. And what you're talking about is that old version that's not going to be the same.
Right.
Wow. So just diving into grief more, why is it that some people grieve longer than others? What's the difference between human beings, personalities, experience, backgrounds, and just this different pace that everybody grieves at?
So I think, and this is me as the grief nerd, like societally now here, especially in the US, we don't do grief well. We don't educate on grief. We don't talk about grief. Someone dies, there's a funeral. And this is the therapist, this is the grief therapist talking, who to this day, most therapy programs do not have a grief course unless it's a very specialized college. So you come out into the world of grief and they don't tell you babies die. They don't tell you parents lose their children. They don't tell, and so for me as a grief specialist, it's important to talk about when we lose a person or when we lose a relationship, a place, a house, a community. We're going to grieve that thing for the rest of our lives. Will it be different? Yes. Will it change shape? Yes. Will we grow around the grief? Yes. But it will always be there. So I think this right now is really big for people. And this happened to me like the week after the fires. People were reaching out to me and Vanessa, this talk and this workshop. And I was like, you guys, no one's doing that. I was like, we're going to be grieving 6 months, a year out from now. Right? People right now need safety, and people right now need to get some literal ground underneath their feet. Right? So to your point, or just exploring this idea of grief, you will rebuild, yes, but you will grieve this in different phases over time. How you feel about it now will feel different 6 months from now, right? And so it's this part of letting people have permission for whatever comes, the anger, the sadness, the frustration, the numb, the shock. People are just coming out of shock now, right?
Yeah.
And that's why people are now really creeping more into the groups, because they're like, oh, I'm feeling it now. I'm having some PTSD now. I'm having flashbacks now, and so it's really sitting with that. And also this part is important. We are human beings. We have had life before this fire. We have had trauma before this fire. We have had predispositions to mental health before this fire, whether it be anxiety, whether it be, childhood trauma. It's important to remember that however we were supported during those times or not is going to impact how we respond to traumatic events now. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. We in pop culture, and we'll talk about some of the misconceptions of this, we talk about these stages of grief, right? And, with this final one being acceptance. And once we get to this acceptance, we're set free. And, we'll break down a little bit of how we can navigate what we know as those 5 stages in a minute. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that, even if you get to some euphoric level of acceptance, like it's with you forever. Like, it's not like, this isn't something that it's something where like the anger and the sadness might might separate or lessen over time,
Yeah.
but the grief will always be there. This is a monumental loss. Just like if you were to, lose a parent at age 20, you would still miss them at age, or you would still grieve for them, when you're in your 80s.
That's right. That's
All
right. And you said something there. Yeah, it'll come back. It sparked something. It'll come back. Okay. Yeah.
Well, no worries. When it does, you'll let me know. But let's kind of explore those 5 stages of grief, because it was one of those things I always had heard about, right? Like, oh, it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, right? And through my prep here, I read that it was created by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it was developed for people who are terminally ill, like the patients, and not the survivors.
Right.
And so things have since been really adapted, but some therapists still use them as more of like a tool than a rule. What should people know about these stages? Because I'm sure they're like, oh yeah, I'm grieving, and they can probably go on Wikipedia or watch the wrong TV show. Like, what should we know about these stages, and how should we either apply them or ignore them completely? What do we do with this 5 stages of grief?
I think it's great information to have in your back pocket about how grief care was informed, right? And yes, she did originally create these stages for folks who were dying, and then they were applied to folks who are grieving. What we kind of, like most things over time, they evolve and you learn things, and I think the most detrimental thing that people can do with the stages is go, I have to start here and go here, 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 and it's like I go straight through and then I'm done. If you do that, you'll be very frustrated with yourself because it won't happen. We weave in and out of them over our life at various stages of time. And I don't think, yes, that word acceptance is very sticky, and a lot of grievers hate it. And, but I think that, take it as information about, right, where you could be, but don't put yourself into a box. Grief, you can't do that, right? There's an image that I love giving my clients, and it's like, here's what reality says grief looks like. It's like this nice, pretty, and then it's like, here's what grief really looks like. And it's like squiggles all over the place, and it's messy, and it's, I'm here and then I'm there and then I'm back there in 6 months. And that's really what it looks like. But there's containment in it. You need to go through those messy and that beautiful, and that to be able to come through the other side with an understanding, right? And I remember what I was going to say, because you said grief will be with you for the rest of your life, and I often talk about grief is love, right? Grief of a person is love. Grief of your home is love, right? So if you think about it in the concept of love, you're always going to love that place. That will be with you, right?
Yeah, while still being heartbroken that you're not there day to day. Right. I want to explore that word acceptance, because there is, like, we don't want it to be this mythical place that people can get to or not get to. But I just, even in my own home, my partner Anna and I, we are at very different paces. I got to the, oh wow, our house burned down, this is awful. Now what are all the things that we have to do to go fix it? When she's like, what? Like, please stop. Like, I need time. And we've been she's a therapist, so we have healthy communication about this sort of thing. But there is this different timeline that people have in terms of and I'm like afraid to say the word acceptance, but I'm going to say acceptance because I don't have a better word.
Right. I think it's about, see, for me, acceptance is more the sense of like, what's real? What's reality? Right? I don't have to accept that my person died. I can't really fully ever accept that happened. Right? I don't want to. Right?
Yeah.
But I know it's reality. I know that he's gone. Right? Your house is gone. Right? So for me, it's, maybe replacing that with other things and seeing how that feels for other people who that word doesn't fit for them.
And I think that's a really good way of saying it, right?
It's that truth.
Yeah, you're acknowledging the logical part of your brain that knows what is black and white is and
Right.
isn't,
Right.
while not wanting to bring it into some like emotional race where, hey, either you're accepting this logical reality or you're not. and
Right.
and I don't think anybody really wants that, right? it's
Right.
it's not a race. We're all in this together, and we all are going to have to go through different days. Like some days you feel like you're on fire, and then like
Hmm.
that's a terrible metaphor to use, isn't it? I apologize. If I was a better editor, I'd probably edit that out. Some days you're feeling really good about yourself, and then
Right.
other days something just hits. And I
Right.
really have liked a lot of the things you've been saying that are very sensory, right? The
Yeah.
smells,
Yeah.
the sights, sounds.
Yeah. Grief is not just an emotional experience. It is a full body somatic, right? And this is
Mhm.
why people have a hard time after their loved ones died going to a certain restaurant, because their body is like, oh my gosh, the smells, the people, the sounds, right? It's the same thing with grieving this space. And going back to what you said, yes, you know, it's that hard reality and that truth word of, I know it's true, but my heart doesn't want to accept that it's true, right? And that's that cognitive dissonance where your heart and your head haven't quite met up with each other, right? And that's
Mhm.
where the grief exists, and being able to process that for people who aren't quite ready to. And isn't it fascinating? And this is true. In a home, here you are with your spouse, you're both on different spectrums of this thing. And it's like, how do we support each other, ebb and flow, when I'm ready to go and I'm supporting her in her
Mhm.
grief, right? And
Absolutely.
both of you are going to go through different grief waves at different times.
Hmm. And that's part of the thing that again goes back to that open communication is, like we're next week, we're getting our debris removal is finally happening. And she expressed to me like that's going to be really hard for me.
Mm.
And I was like, oh my gosh, like I couldn't feel more opposite while still respecting the way that you feel, right? Like I'm
Right.
tired of my old lot looking like, as our guest last week called it Hiroshima. I want it to be a
Mm.
blank canvas. I want to like I don't want to see the ruins of the old day. I want to see the possibility of the next. And she's just like, but once all there, it's like then it's gone. And so it's certainly different perspectives and different
Yeah.
feelings, but and that's again, I think one of the things I've learned through her is like as long as you know that your feelings are your feelings and their feelings are their feelings and nobody's right or wrong, we just have to respect
Right.
where the other one's at. Then I think you can have the healthy conversations and move forward together, even if you're not in the same place.
Yeah. What really strikes me when you say that is, when someone dies, you are left with things. You are left with their things, your things together. In this disaster, you didn't get to have that, right? You didn't get to choose when it was time to go through the things. The things were taken from you, they were robbed from you, right? And so for
Yeah.
me, isn't it fascinating, even in this moment where she's like, it's all rubble, it's there, but for her, it's hers. For her, it's like, this is what I have left of this, my things,
Mhm.
right? And so in that, I say, take pictures of the rubble, go get those ashes. We talk about transitional objects. A transitional object is something that connects you to that place in time, right? So this is why
Mhm.
people going back and finding little, even if it was a key or it was, a screw to a photo, whatever it might be, but it's like that was a tangible thing that they could hold and feel that this thing was real,
Mm.
right? And so many
Yeah.
people didn't get to have that, and that makes this so much more um, devastating, right?
Mhm.
That you didn't have that natural grieving, right? That you would have, right? Had it been a death. Um, and you triggered this thought, which has been very difficult, but I have had clients who I was seeing before the fire who lived in Altadena, who had lost their spouse or their kid,
Mhm.
And so they also were grieving their person, and now they also don't have the things of their person.
Man, yeah. I mean, gosh, talk about a level that's just so intense, and and I
Yeah.
guess that kind of goes back to that overall communal feeling of like, what do we have to do to make sure that we're there for those neighbors, and how do we make sure that, because we even though society talks more therapeutically now than it used to,
Right.
it's still not like we're sitting there and going, hey, how are you grieving? Am I offering you enough space? Right.
Right.
And it's more just and then obviously people now, as we're kind of moving forward, and even this kind of a little bit about what the show is about, is like there's competing priorities, right? And so it's, I guess, like my question is like, what are like some healthy ways for us to carry this grief? Because I think, like you said, it's never going anywhere, right? And it
Right.
is love, right?
Right.
And I love that. I love grief as love. And how do we bring that into that rebuilding process without feeling like we have to like leave behind our past? Because we can have both, right?
Absolutely. Well, you do, and both exist and both will exist, right? And so I think that the idea of ritual, right, is creating
Hmm.
form to something that
Yeah.
feels formless,
Hmm.
right? And so being able to come together and things, and that could be individual rituals that people do, that could be collective
Hmm.
rituals that people do, coming together and doing, kind of a collective grief art night where people come together and get, whether they've gathered different branches from the trees in the area or leaves or whatever it may be, and create art based on the place and the time, right?
Hmm.
um, the idea of planting in general is beautiful because um, you're tending to the soil, you're tending to the regrowth,
Hmm.
right? So coming together and having a ritual where everyone's replanting or doing something like that, right? um, Art is a great way for grief to be expressed, especially for the, not only for the kiddos but for the adults, right?
Hmm.
But I've had a lot of parents whose kids they're like, how do I take care of my kid? Trying to take care of me too, and the grief can be beautifully expressed that way, right? um, I think people coming together and doing like rituals for food, right? There are a lot of,
Hmm.
community things going on, right? What feels nurturing to you? What feels homey to you, right? And doing that with each other.
Yeah, I read about this group in the Santa Rosa fire. It was like a street or neighborhood or something, and like every Wednesday night they got together. And it's middle Sonoma County, so they all bring like a bottle of wine, and
Right.
they start sharing resources and talking. And we've done a couple smaller events like on our street, with
Mm-hmm.
our people. And it's interesting because people are getting so much information from other places. They've got resources to share, and it's really like that part becomes really exciting, right? Like
Right.
I'm I'm currently, I got my house surveyed, and now I'm like currently trying to help a bunch of different neighbors work with this surveyor because he's going to be able to give them like a massive discount if he can come out in the same day, and I'm not getting anything for it, but like I feel like I look so involved now that people are like, oh, what kind of cutback is this guy? I'm like, I'm just trying to help, and now I'm like, now
Right.
I'm in the middle. But I
Right.
think I think to your point, like there is something to that ritual, because what happens is at first you show up and you kind of don't know, and like I said before, like some of the neighbors were all trying to like either get acquainted or reacquainted a little
Mm,
bit, and oh yeah, you had that dog, you know, and then part of that trust is like you show up to the first one and then you just know that people are going to show up again,
that's
and
right.
so that they're there too. And so the part of the ritual, or I mean the big part of the ritual, if you're going to be doing these types of activities, is that everyone's showing up together for themselves and for each other.
Right. Absolutely. And this part we talked about earlier for the folks who aren't going to be there, the idea of individual ritual too, whether that's creating, a space in the new space that honors your old space, right? So if people did
Mhm.
go and get soil or ashes, right? If they want to um, take, photographs from the house, if they want to, right? It's creating like an altar, if you will, that existed, right? We want to make sure that we're giving people ritual to honor that, right? In their new spaces, right? As well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know when you were talking about the, the groups being much harder for people right now, and they're, for therapy, right? And so there's an individual therapy that, most people are preferring, and I totally get that. But is there something more to, at some of these events or these, these opportunities to come together, something with storytelling? Is storytelling something in a, let's call it a non-therapeutic setting, let's just call it
Yeah.
a group community meetup, like where's the power of storytelling intertwined with this?
Huge. And people need to, I think this is the huge part of not feeling dismissed in the grief process, of being able to share your story. Where were you that night? That's the first thing that people talk about. Well, here, that was the moment you found out, the moment you went home, the moment you, whatever it was, right? That will forever be part of the process. And I think having safe spaces to do that, share that narrative, it also helps you process the trauma when you do that, right?
Yeah.
And there's something so, I think, culturally deep about the ritual of storytelling. It's how we remember, right? It's how we're seen. I also love the idea of being able to put that into other forms of art that you maybe can't say with words. I've been talking to people about, can we write a song about it? Can we write a poem about it? Can you make me a playlist, about what that feels like for you? Right?
Yeah, one of the things my family did, which is pretty cool, we got we used to collect different mugs, like when we traveled, and so they didn't burn completely, but none of them are intact. And so the kids and Anna, they put together they've got as many of them as possible, and they've been starting to work with a mosaic artist out of Glendale to try, and I think they're either going to make them into coasters or something. I don't think they know yet, but there's something there as they're going through this process, something that we'll put in the next house.
This speaks to me so much, and I don't know if you. So the name of my grief center is Kintsugi Grief Center, and Kintsugi is the Japanese word for repairing broken pieces of pottery, right? And it is this idea, this metaphor of meaning through mending your brokenness. And this is exactly it. People find a way to mend, right? What hurts, right? And here they are doing it with the mosaic, right? And this is what we do with for the grief center, is actually having people, and I've talked about this with folks, are there pieces that you still have? And if not, we bring in tiles and things like that. We break them and then we mend them with the gold, right? And the idea is, in the Japanese philosophy, is that the piece is much more resilient after it's been broken and mended than it was before it broke, right? And so here's your family, here's your kids, here's your wife, creating that, right? It's that metaphorical process of healing, this, healing along the journey, right? Of what was. And that those mugs, right, are now going to be wherever this new space is going to be, and that's your altar, that's your honoring of holding both.
Well, and in the spirit of holding both, one of the things I talked about at the top was right after 9/11, and the way that Saturday Night Live opened like 2.5 weeks afterwards, and they landed a little joke in the cold opening after honoring all the first responders, and it was kind of this thing like you had like permission to laugh, right? And so how do we give ourselves permission to how do we honor Altadena like before the fire, but give us permission to like imagine what can be, what can we, how do we give ourselves permission to, I don't know, get to the point of actually being excited?
Yeah. That will come individually with each person, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I also think there's this part, there's that survivor's guilt that's been floating around, and
Mm-hmm.
how do I enjoy life again? How do I, and the reality is, whether it's, the fires or a death, we're still here. We're still here, right? And we are going to thaw out from this very frozen, grief, some of us, right? Slowly, more slower than others, and
Mm-hmm.
some are not, right? But I also love the idea, and maybe this is going to be something that you do, is yeah, maybe you get some folks in the community come and do a comedy night. Maybe you got, maybe this gets to be a ritual of let's laugh again, right? Let's dance again. Let's whatever again. Like, the idea, grief, when you think of a griever, you think of like a very stoic, you know, not no movement in grief, right? But in order to live again in grief, we have to move. We have to, express, whether it's through art, through comedy, through dance, through whatever it is. And for some people, it will be slower than others,
Mm-hmm.
but it will come. And I think it's this idea of holding, as I say to my clients, I'm going to hold that hope for you until you're ready
Mm-hmm.
to reach out and come get it, and it's a gradual, right? But it, you know, these are the moments I'm hearing in the people that I know that are like, oh my gosh, Vanessa, like I had a normal moment today. Like I went to coffee with friends and I didn't even think about it. I didn't even think about the fire for like 10, 20 minutes, half an hour. And it was so good for me. Right. I also think that, and this is why I think people aren't coming to the groups right now too, is you can only be grieving for so like intensely.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's like that quote that Yalom said, grief is like staring at the sun. If you do it too long, you'll go blind. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Same here. Be in your grief space. Make sure you've got other spaces where you don't have to be in your grief that day, right? Could be coffee with friends, could be going on a date night, could be going to a dance class or a comedy. But let me just have half an hour where I'm not in my grief, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I think that, it creates space for the living.
I think one of the things I'm learning through this conversation is because I feel like I have a little bit more of the logical kind of brain than the emotional. So I'm kind of like, oh, what can we give people? What tools can we give? And all the
Yeah.
things that you're saying, laughing, dancing, being artistic, expressing yourself, those are much more about opening up emotions that you have outside of grief, right? So it's not like just like a thing or a check of the lit,
Right.
check mark, right? Oh, good, we
Let
got
me
that
tell you.
done.
Yeah. Let me tell you, if we had that, I would be out of job. Because let me tell you something. And like this is you're so right on because the number one question I get from grievers is, Vanessa, can you tell me how long this will take? And as a grief therapist, I'm like, oh, you're gonna hate my answer. you know. But I tell, it's that part I told you earlier that it does change, right? We do grow, right? We grow
Hmm.
around it. There's that metaphor of like at the beginning of grief, imagine holding a really, really heavy boulder, right? As we walk through and we process and we do the art and we do the, right, this boulder becomes something that, we can hold it. It's in our pocket,
Hmm.
right? It's still there, but it's not as heavy as it was, but it's always there, right? But I can dance with
Hmm.
it there. I can coffee with it there. I can, right? And so it's that part of, that expression like we're talking about. But you're absolutely right. If I could give you a checklist, I would. Because, and I hear you because you have this, you're and I'm seeing you too. You're definitely having emotions as we're talking about this, and I want to
Hmm.
acknowledge that. And I also know that you're deeply caring for your community and you want to give them support. You want to give them that roadmap, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think just in whether I'm leading a company in my other life or working in a community, like my strengths are motivating, getting people excited. Right. And so
Right.
this is not the best time for me.
Right.
But I do think that there's something that I really want to kind of explore, which is this idea of, meeting people where they're at and being able to, either create a vision or just a message of hope, a neighborhood where, hey, maybe you're a little closer to your neighbors than you were 3 months ago. And now your houses are all running on solar and they're more fire resistant than they were. And they probably have some nicer new appliances as well. And, maybe some fun new retail is here too. Like there is a vision of a great next community.
Yeah.
But and in the spirit of that feeling of probably wanting to get there a little too fast, how can we start to provide that hope in a way that people will actually hear it and maybe even help them in that grieving and eventually resiliency.
Yeah. Well, I'm also thinking about you too in this process, right? Because you also don't want to be, what do I want to say? Validating where you're at. And it must be really hard for you right now because I can see it in you and I can hear it in you and you're like, let's go, and that's okay too. Right. This is that part of the whole spectrum can exist and there's nothing wrong with how, like you said, everyone, as I say in a grief group, when everyone sits down, number one rule of grief group, just like Fight Club, I'm like, if you start to compare yourself to anybody in the room, say it out loud now, as we, say it out loud so we can support you in it, right? Because the minute you start to feel like, oh man, theirs is worse than mine, or I'm about what, it just gets messy, and so I think for you in this process, like I said a minute ago, for the folks who are like not there yet, you tell them, I know you're not there yet, and I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to hold that hope for you until you're ready to feel it too. Right. I mean, I do think that's a beautiful thing to share because you're validating and witnessing where they're at without pushing them on the agenda because you can't get them there. There's gonna be no
and I definitely don't even want to, right? Like I'd say that going back to that analogy, I just want them to know. And I think there's other people in this space where our hands are there and we're ready to help you get wherever you're going whenever you're ready.
Right. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because I do think, again, just like in your household, the two of you are going to support each other, right? There's going to be days where if you were both in it, it'd be really rough, right? But the fact that you can bring some levity to it and some hopefulness, right, is probably going to buoy her on the days that she really needs it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And on the days where you might feel deeper in your grief, it feels safe because she can sit with you in it, right? And so it holds both, right?
Wow, it's grief is absolutely a very powerful force, and it's we're all feeling it differently, and it's so cool to be able to explore these different areas and then see how we can honor everybody. And you give so many amazing ideas on different ways that we can really reconnect emotionally and do some of the things we love without having to stay in it, but also knowing that it's not going to go away.
Yeah, and this always happens for me. Like it kind of activates ideas in my brain of new rituals, but maybe there's something to be done in the community or things that you're doing where, whether you do a dinner night, it's like, there's a wishing tree or a hope tree or a possibility tree, and everyone writes down, well, what's one thing that's possible in this scenario, and everybody shares their possible. Everybody shares the one thing they're hopeful about. Everyone shares the one thing, right, that they wish they can integrate into this new space, right? But maybe it's that well, what does that look? What is my possible? Right. And maybe people really need to sit with that. And for some people, it's hard to tap into that right now.
Yeah.
Right. But maybe there's something to be had about, well, what does that look like? You
Well, I
know?
think if there's one thing that we've learned, it's that grief and hope can live together. We can segment them in different spots. We can channel them when we need them, but ultimately it's okay to have both of them within us because they are somewhat synonymous, knowing that grief is very much love and, hope is that, desire for a better future. So, Vanessa, this was absolutely amazing. I love this, every bit of this conversation. Where can the listeners find you?
Yeah, so my grief center is called Kintsugi, Kintsugi Grief Center, and I'm here in Pasadena. And that's where I run my grief support groups of all ages, all types of loss, and also my individual grief counseling. And for anyone who's listening who's a therapist, always doing grief trainings and workshops for more of us out there who want to be supporting folks in grief.
Oh, yeah, this was amazing. Thank you so much, Vanessa. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.